Welcome to Marjorie Portnow, Prescott Visiting Artist, and to students, faculty, and a few special guests. I first heard of Marjorie Portnow in the late 1980s when I worked at Gilbert Gallery on 57th Street in New York City, because Marjorie was represented by Fishback Gallery in the same building, 50 West 57th Street. Later, much later in 2012, I met her at the Vermont Studio Center, where she was the visiting critic, and she came to my studio, and it was such a delight to talk with her. Her work is excellent in its subtle and abstract elements, its bending of space, and I particularly like the way you build from that place where the sky meets the earth. And she has taught at many fine places and won highly prestigious awards. And one of her students on our faculty, Eileen Mooney, is going to say some introductory remarks.
Long ago, from 2004 to 2006, I studied painting under Marjorie at WestCon. Apart from being a fantastic painter, which you can plainly see from her show in the dining hall, she was a fantastic teacher. Maybe she still is my teacher. Yes, she is. Everyone in our program loved her, and everyone I met who knew her loved her. She made every student that she had realize that they could paint, and we all grew so much because of her guidance and advice. But Marjorie is really the best. Like, she's the best of the best of the best. And I'm so glad that she's here. Yay, Marjorie.
I wish I was there. This is a good second best, but I wish I was there, and I'd give you a big hug. You're going to make me emotional now.
Thank you, Eileen and Marjorie.
Thank you first. I wanted to thank you and Miss Porter's school. You've been so generous with your time and picking up the paintings and hanging the show because of the crazy virus. And we've had such interesting talks. I want to thank you for that too. We had probably almost a few hours, quote, just seeing if the images were okay. We just started talking about art. It was great. So thank you for that. Appreciate that.
It's an honor and a pleasure.
I just want to say that I feel very lucky to have painting in my life. And I feel very lucky to have had incredible teachers. I share a lot of those incredible teachers with Greer, because Greer, we sort of, I mean, I'm older, maybe a whole generation older, but when Greer worked at Sholkoff, a lot of my teachers showed there. And I want to thank all my wonderful teachers, particularly Gabriel Latterman and Leonard Anderson, who were very important to me. And I was so lucky to have a whole group of painters who were passionately committed to doing this thing, which when I started painting in the late 60s, 70s, no one was painting from observation. So I wanted to acknowledge that there was a whole group of people who were very supportive of each other. So with landscape painting, there's a problem with making a world in entirety, which usually means you paint fast and quick so that all the areas of observation and color, for me, make a kind of space that, well, Greer and I talked about this, goes way back to the distance. And this painting was hard to manage because it was over so many times that I went out there, so many 3-hour sessions. So this one is also brings up something that's interesting, because in the back hills, I don't know if you can see where I'm pointing or not, there's so there's the foreground, there's the middle ground marsh, and then there's the background. Right. And in the big painting, behind the marsh is the development of the same kind of land. But this, the foreground is a park. And one of the things with landscape painting, which I learned actually from Richard Ciriani, there's a whole bunch of people who studied with these teachers. I guess it went from Fairfield to Rackstraw, and then, well, sort of people my age. And then, so when we would go painting together sometimes, Richard Ciriani, and we would talk about painting in endangered marshes. So I have a lot of marsh paintings. So it's not overtly political, but all of these things that a person, a painter thinks about, the politics, the environment, beside the construction of it, goes into these, and the paintings bring up different things. So the background in this, that lump of gray over here in the back, there's the marsh in the middle ground. So I'm standing on Route 1 in San Diego, looking at Torrey Pines. So I'm looking at where I painted, where that big painting in the sketch is from. So that is sort of the equivalent of the sketch for the other one. Sometimes I do a sketch in the middle of working on a very complicated long-term painting, because the problem of painting in plein air is waiting for the same or similar light circumstance and time of day. And I guess that's what interests me, the challenge of creating a sense of something very momentary, but also being in the landscape, there's the sense of a world where it's going to outlast everything, everyone, the environment, if we don't mess it up. And there is a sense of, the fog is going to come in, the sun is going to rise, the tide is going to go out, which is sort of the opposite of a particular moment in time. And I guess I'm interested in both of them. And in the sketches, it's really more about the momentary, but in those longer, more complex, sustained paintings, it's more about a world that's eternal and going to exist. And it makes me, when I'm painting out there, feel very transitory, very little. And I like that feeling of much larger things than me when I'm trying to capture, the light, the air, the circumstance. This is a sketch for the larger Wilder Ranch artichoke field. And so what was interesting about this, when I wanted to keep painting on a painting in coastal California, this is Wilder Ranch there's the ocean on the horizon, so it's coastal, and the fog comes in. So the whole right side of this painting is a cloudy day painting, and Greer and I were talking, if you cover the painting with your hand, so you just see the left side, right? Yeah, you can that's a particular light circumstance. And on the left side is where the fog didn't go. So that's a sunny light place. And I wanted to see if I could get two different kinds of light in one painting where I could change the atmosphere and it still works as an entire unit. That was the challenge of this painting. And it was good because I could go out and work plein air when it was foggy or when it was sunny. There was always something to work on. Sometimes there's a question of how do you decide when you're walking outdoors in the landscape where to set up and where to paint. And that's a big question for landscape painters. And sometimes you're just, this time I was just walking down the road and there was something about the distribution of lights and darks and the color. And I just said, oh, further down the road is where I would set up. But I thought, oh, I'm just going to do this because it's so beautiful. There was something about this that moved me to paint. That's the Wilder Ranch one. So that was the long sustained painting. Let's see. That middle part of the painting, the inner circle in a way, is what the sketch where the fog came in is painted from. So it's as if you put a window in the middle of the painting. And for this painting, because I wanted it to have the enormous breadth of the California landscape, it's about 180-degree view. So I would turn my head, and perception in the landscape is interesting because if you don't turn your head, you have about a 60-degree cone of vision. But if you want to indicate how huge the world is, I was always interested in panoramas. I would turn my head, which makes things bend a lot, which sometimes you can work on conceptually, or sometimes you just paint to your right, to the center, and then turn your head and paint to the left. So there's a lot of, it's not just random. Choosing a composition for me is not just random. And it's an interesting balance between wanting something to look as if it mimics the real world, but it's sort of not possible to actually be in one place and see all of that. So these are all, different ideas I have painting. This is obviously when the tide goes out in Provincetown, and it's one of the few times where I tried to make the painting almost entirely about the foreground and what was happening at my feet. It's a real challenge to try and coordinate the tide, the weather, the light, and the season. I don't know if they convey that, but when the tide goes out, the more I look at the landscape, the more I see things that are interesting to paint. So this is part of the California crowd, and it's a trailhead hiking in San Diego, which is where the Route 1 and Torrey Pines are also. uh, I struggled with this foreground, and I put this one in with the same composition, but the light being different. The background is painted much more loosely. The marshes, this is maybe interesting because there's a series of marshes, and I don't usually paint in the winter, but it was warm on Cape Cod. This is Wellfleet next to Provincetown, and the marshes turn this incredible color. So it's also in the season that I take my cue from, this one was just totally standing there. And I do come in and paint over them. Usually I paint over the foregrounds because they're not as successful to me. Or I'll repaint the sky, not the horizon usually. So this is just totally from perception, and I was just caught by the color of a clear, it was around December.
I love this one.
Because they're so different. This is very different. This started out totally from plein air, from observation. And I kept painting over it. And I'm not even sure it's the final iteration of this painting. My window in East Hampton here in my loft looks out over water and a mountain, and there's frequently fog and mist. So I looked out my window, and even though this is from Vermont, this is a misty, foggy day in Vermont, I looked at that and then painted on this painting. So it's sort of made up based on a painting I started in Vermont and just never was satisfied with. It's hard to know when to stop. For me, if it's in the studio, easier because the light goes in 3 hours. If I'm painting plein air, I just have to stop. But I don't have to stop in the studio. I always was amazed at looking at the Impressionists, Monet in particular. You know, when you get up close, you can see the paint, and it's about the touch, and it's about the abstraction of the touch and the paint. And when, yeah, you can see the scale. But when there's a viewing distance from Monet and from my paintings, which I guess happens when you photograph them, the surface sort of disappears and they do look photographic. And that magic of, in a Monet or in a lot of Impressionist paintings, when you get up close, you do see the abstraction. And when you get far away, if you're sort of right, I was going to say right, I don't know right or wrong, but if the color and the tone, the value and the color and the intensity are mimicking observation, it will look like a photograph. But I never paint from photographs. I paint from my paintings, but somehow they do look like photographs, and people always think they are photographic. I'm sure they look photographic on the screen, but they're not. Sometimes it's hard to know how literal to get when you're trying to capture a moment. The more literal I find I am, And I could use the word detail, but that's a really bad word. But the more little strokes I put in, and make each form more complicated, the more it looks like a photograph, and the more the time, it looks like time stands still. And when I paint a sketch, it's obvious that it's very fast. And that has a whole different sense of time. And sometimes this is, to me, it's almost like a freeze frame that references, I don't know, I don't want to, maybe not eternity, but you know, that the earth is going to endure. It's more than a lifetime, you know, beyond my life, beyond anyone's lifetime. When I scraped it off, all the layers, it's like pentimenti was showing through, and it was a wonderful surface. And I went in and made sort of the foreground cactus-like forms. I outlined them too much, but this foreground really came from scraping out a painting and having just the colors be mimic sand or mimic that California earth. And I got very excited about that. That meant more to me than painting that road over and over to try and get the light bouncing off it and the color change from the road in the foreground all the way back to the middle ground and the background. It goes up to Torrey Pines, the road up US 1. Where the sky meets the horizon, if to me, if that harmony isn't, if it isn't in harmony, I can never get the light. I can never get that sense of a box of air. So I start there, and frequently the first time, unless it's a sketch, that I'm doing a painting, I'll draw the horizon line at the place where the sky meets the horizon, and then literally walk backwards and end up at the foreground. So I'm painting color patch, stroke next to color patch, a stroke. So by changing the color, I'm trying to make the space. And usually the detail in the foliage is totally different when it's close up and far away. The sky as a canopy over your head, start at the horizon and go back and try and walk it so that when I look up over my head, that's where the top of the sky is in the painting. So I'm trying to make the depth mimic the depth of the land. Start, you know, thinking of the sky as having a foreground and then a background ending up at the horizon. It's when I'm in painting, it's like you're in the middle of something. It's wonderful. I'm not thinking of anything else but the air and the space and how beautiful what I'm looking at is. But to start, that motivation is hard because it's very, it's difficult. And the reason I paint over so much is that it's not easy for me, and I make a lot of mistakes and failures. And it's hard to start again if, you know, where I've ended up is like, oh, it's not finished, or it's wrong, or it looks terrible to me. But in a way, that's a motivation too. I think if I was an easier painter, I think if I could do everything and it turned out wonderfully well, I don't think I would be as motivated to paint. I always want to make it better. I always have to make it better. And that's why I keep painting. So always was interested in light. I started painting landscapes in 1964 when I went to Skowhegan. That's a long time ago. And all I could manage to paint, I was on a dirt road and there was a barn in front of me. And then on either side of this red barn was a tree on the left and a tree on the right. And that's what I chose to paint, red against green. And I wanted to show the shadow covering part of the red barn. So I was always interested in light. That hasn't changed, but I kind of expanded. I wanted more. So what's more? More is more space. More is more complicated compositions. More is more unusual types of landscape. So that pretty much is how it expanded. But the light is what I'm interested in, and making, like Gabriel said, a box of air. And I'm always trying to make the atmosphere more palpable. Corot did very complicated studio paintings. He painted on site. He painted from tradition, painted tonally as well as color to color. To me, he just balanced everything. If I could do, that's what I'm trying, that's my motivation, to do one painting that's close to a Corot, which, you know, I'll have to paint for 100 more years to get that. I started out wanting to write, and I went to college, 4-year school as a writer. I thought I would write poetry, and I found that it was too difficult for me. So I took an art history course, and it was writing, but it was writing about painting. So what I discovered was it was the painting that was really more interesting to me than the writing. So I took some art classes at I went to Western Reserve University, and the Cleveland Art Institute was right there. So I took some night classes, and that just interested me more than anything else. So it was late in life, as I was graduating, and I went to Pratt art school after I graduated from college with a BA in art history. So color, you can use color a million different ways. As a pattern, I use color as light and space. And because I'm mostly observational, color I work with more than any other color is green. It's not a color I like, it's a color that I have to use. If I was decorating a house, I think I would choose blues, but I'm not using color decoratively. So one of the wonderful things that this show has done for me is that is a watercolor. So I do paint inside. I mean, I'll finish it eventually. And what I work with in my studio are sketches. So that's a sketch that I did on site in California. And I have that up so I can use that for the other. This is a sketch. So my wall is paintings that, this is another one. I have one more here. This is another one. So I can't use photographs just because they come out terribly. It's all flat. So I'm using these. Okay. I took this off the wall. Oh, there's another watercolor above it. Yeah. So I try and paint this painting especially the foreground, although I don't like the middle ground either, from, there's another watercolor. So that's what I do during the winter, except I could paint out my window, which I haven't started yet. And I love painting water, and I love California. It's not so green, which is good. I'm not thinking about what I want to express so much. That's afterwards, I see if there's something that comes through. But when I go outside, I mostly think about, wow, that's interesting, the way the river curves, and my eye goes from the river to the horizon, back up along that tree, then down. And it's really interesting how the clouds are reflected in the water. That's what I'm thinking of. I'm not thinking of expressing feelings, really. I'm thinking how to construct what I see. I do think it's important to have paintings that express a particular emotion. And I noticed afterwards that mine seemed to be calm or orderly. I don't set out to do that. I just set out to, expressing feelings isn't like constructing a painting. I'm really trying to construct a painting when I'm out there. I don't know if that makes sense, but how do I choose my palette from what I'm looking at? Well, I construct my palette according to the kind of light that I'm looking at, and the palette changes as the light changes in the landscape. So a lot of it is observational until I get them in the studio, and then I fool around with it. My palette is a warm and cool red, meaning alizarin crimson cool and cadmium red medium. A warm and, well, I use more than two, but a warm and cool blue like ultramarine and manganese, which is like cerulean. One is yellower, one is redder. And then a warm and cool yellow, lemon, and usually I throw in another one, but lemon, cadmium medium. And you can mix all the earth colors from it, but it takes so long to mix that I also put it in my palette. I have the earth colors, yellow ochre and burnt sienna. I use those too, because what I'm interested in is color to color to color, making light and space. And that's an atmosphere, a palpable air. And I can't look at, especially a color photograph, more a black and white I can sometimes use, but I find that if I'm looking at a photograph and trying to paint a painting from a photograph, I get so seduced by the photograph. I'm just making a painting of a photograph. I can't abstract from it because it's abstracted already. But when I paint plein air, and when I do my painting sketches, the difference is my criteria. When I'm painting plein air, I'm looking at the space and I'm trying to mix a color that will sit in space the way the landscape, the color of that tree sits in space. When I'm painting in my studio, it's a little more abstracted. I'm trying to make more spatial connections and more rhythms. I'll connect things, but I'll see inside, away from the criteria of observation, I'm looking at the criteria of an interesting painting. And I'm looking at a painting and I'm saying, oh, the foreground doesn't connect to the background. So if if I want the foreground to be more prominent, like in music, louder, I'll make it more detailed to bring it up further. If I want if part of the painting is softer and I want the whole painting to be soft, I can do that. So it's really like what Eileen said. I look at a painting indoors, what's the part I like the best? And if there's something that falls, usually something that falls short or outside of what I like about the painting, I'll try and figure out a way of making everything hold together as a world, as a whole atmosphere. And I don't think about that when I'm outside. I'm just trying to get, it's easier because my criteria is looking. How do I know when to stop in the studio? I'm not sure. No, I don't have a brand that I use. Kremnitz white I'll use with Old Holland, but it's very expensive. Old Holland has the most intense color because they use less mixer in it, less filler. But, I have all different brands of paint, Williamsburg, Old Holland, Gamblin, Utrecht. I don't really write too much anymore. I've written about other people's paintings or about painting. That's interesting. When I did write, yeah, when I would write poetry, it would be, that's interesting. It would be about something maybe mundane in real life, but use it as a metaphor for a larger feeling, a larger emotion. And maybe that's what I do in painting. It seems like it's literal, but it's very tricky, especially with so-called realist painting, the difference between, and in fiction and in good writing, between something that's literal, very literal and descriptive, and then the next level of, oh, that's sort of a metaphor. And the person who's reading or looking at the painting, hopefully, will start thinking about other things and go on to relate that painting or that writing to their life or to philosophical things or to larger states of emotional feeling. So I think Rackstraw Downs once talked about the art of depiction as being, I don't know what he exactly meant by that, but there's difference between, and I don't know if Eileen remembers that at WestCon, this was always a big bone of contention. If something is like illustrative and literal, what's the difference between that and a painting that also is very realistic, but that is considered great art? That's a really tough distinction. And that's sort of what I'm talking about. I think painting quickly and painting very complicated paintings over a long period of time are really different states of energy. And sometimes you feel like running and dancing. And sometimes you feel like sitting very still and thinking very slowly, or not even thinking, just sitting and looking at the water. They're just different states of energy and being. And as I said, I feel lucky that I have painting, because I can go through all these various, all the complications of my life. I can sort of, I mean, not consciously, but are in painting. I can use painting to learn about and experience. Painting has taught me a lot. So I have an older painting. Where is it? This little one. No, yeah. Except there. Is it in the light now? I like that painting. I'm not sure I could tell you why, but that painting, I don't think I would change anything. I know maybe I'll put it all in shadow. Is that better? Or I think I like paintings. This one, oh, Greer liked this one too. Except the computer is making a shadow over half of it. And I do keep one or two that when I say my favorite or that I like it, I couldn't change anything to make it better. I don't know enough to make it better. So that's my bar, my criteria bar. Those paintings, I have to have them come up to that.
Marjorie, another question that you would ask us when I was at WestCon was, like, when we were in the studios, like, you'd be like, okay, let's say the whole place is burning down. Which painting would you take? And I feel like that's the same, like, if I was to ask you that same question, like in that way, like, which painting from your wall would you take? And it had to be one of your own, not on the other side, which are all your friends' paintings.
Yeah, some of those are better. I like those too. Yeah, I like those too, because I don't think I could change anything. And what's the quality I like in them? If I could say it in words, I wouldn't put in a painting, but visually, those two that I showed you, I would take those. And I think it is a good question, because it visually shows you what you like about your own work, so you can keep going on that path. It's hard to figure out how to push your own path further and further. That's really tough, but recognize, and when I'm painting outside, I'm not thinking about any of this, but when you come in the studio, it's good to say which one you like the most, because it makes you realize where you want to go, and it gives you a path if you can figure it out. So those two. And I try and always hang on my wall one or two that I really like, and bring the other ones up. I don't know what bring it up means. It means that every mark, in a way, is locked in, and I couldn't change it to make it better. I guess that's what it is. Hard.
There's still lots of people here, and I know we've kind of gone over our usual Prescott time, but I want to invite one more question, and then people feel free to go if you need to go, and maybe some of you would like to stay a little bit longer.
Yeah, I don't mind. I'm here for as long as anyone has a question, actually.
Do you only paint landscapes, or?
Oh, okay. Yeah, the person that impressed me when I was a student was Leonard Anderson, who paints everything. And here, I'm having trouble with the shadow of the computer. Here's a little self-portrait. Can you see that?
Yeah.
And I have some other around the house. So I did do that. And I have, not up, I have painted still lifes because Leonard painted the most beautiful still lifes and portraits. I'm thinking of him because he has a show that's up now and just had a show at the New York Studio School, and he was a teacher of mine. This is going to sound weird, but I think my portraits and my still lives look like anyone else's. Whether they're good or bad, I don't think they have a particular, like, I don't think you'd recognize it as my particular work, meaning there isn't a strong voice in the portraits or the still lives. I don't know why. Maybe I just don't connect to objects or portraits or people as much as the landscape. But somehow, because I think it's important to look and think about your work critically as well as to paint. But somehow, looking at my work over the years, it just seemed that my landscapes sort of looked like mine. In particular, there was something about them that, like, they would say they could tell it was mine. And I don't think that's true about the portraits or the still lives. And I think I recognized that, and I recognized that the experience for me of being in the landscape and outside also had a very transcendent and psychological, spiritual meaning to me that I probably could find in portraiture, but not in still lives. I don't know why. Morandi certainly could do it. So I just realized that I connected more with the forces of nature, and I could sort of get rid of my ego and just, when you're in painting class and 3 hours is up and it felt like 5 minutes, that feeling of being in the middle of something happens more to me when I'm in the landscape.
Maybe we should call it a night again, but thank you all for being here. It's really, this is an historic moment. I'm just so thankful that she could do this and that we could all share this together. So have
It's a real gift, Greer. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Greer.
Thank you.
Thank you, Greer. Thanks, Eileen.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Calling it an evening, but I just,
Sure.
again, was just so thankful, as were others, that you could share all this with us.
It was my pleasure. It really was a gift you gave me because, going over my work and thinking about it and thinking about what I wanted to say taught me a lot. I mean, I wouldn't do that normally. I'd just go from painting to painting to painting without like any overview.
It's a real gift that you've shared so much of your life here tonight, and thank you so much. It's a real
Well,
reward.
One reason I really meant what I said, that I was so thankful that Greer asked me, and thank him so much, because it did put me back into this different head of, oh, I have to think about words to explain my painting, and it was great. It made me think a little more, because just by myself, I kind of drift off. I could do this repeated because I couldn't get the